In 1982, a small team of scientists hiked onto the surface of a dead volcano carrying cages full of gophers. Not seeds, not saplings, not truckloads of soil. Gophers, the buck-toothed rodents that gardeners across America spend their weekends trying to kill. The plan was almost too simple to take seriously. Drop a handful of them onto a patch of gray volcanic wasteland. Let them dig for a single day, then take them away again. That was it. One day. Then the Gophers went home. To almost everyone watching, it looked like a joke. This was Mount St. Helens 2 years after the most destructive volcanic eruption in American history. Hundreds of square miles had been flattened, buried, and sterilized. The world's top ecologists were saying it could take a century, maybe centuries, for real life to return to the worst of it. And here was a team proposing to fix a piece of it with pocket gophers borrowed from a nearby forest on loan for 24 hours. It sounded ridiculous. It wasn't. Because 40 years later, scientists went back to those exact patches of ground. And what they found in the soil was so striking, it made headlines around the world. The places the gophers had touched for one single day in 1982 were still alive, still thriving, still fundamentally different from the dead ground a few feet away. 4 decades after the animals were carried off the mountain. A single afternoon of digging had triggered a recovery that is still unfolding today. To understand how a rodent could do what 100 scientists assumed would take 100 years, you first have to understand exactly what died on that mountain, and why everyone was so sure it was gone for good. At 8:32 in the morning on May 18th, 1980, a magnitude 5.1 earthquake shook the north face of Mount St. Helens. And then, the entire side of the mountain slid off. It became the largest landslide ever recorded in human history. More than 2 billion tons of rock, ice, and snow peeled away in seconds. And the moment that mass slid off, it uncorked the pressure that had been building inside the volcano like a shaken bottle. The mountain exploded sideways. A wall of superheated gas and rock blasted out of the north flank at hundreds of miles an hour, faster than the landslide it was chasing. It didn't rise, it flattened. The lateral blast tore across the landscape and leveled everything in its path. Roughly 200 square miles of mature forest knocked flat in minutes. Ancient trees snapped like matchsticks and laid down in rows, all pointing away from the mountain like the hands of a broken clock. When it was over, the numbers were almost impossible to absorb. The eruption killed 57 people. It wiped out an estimated 7,000 large animals, deer, elk, bears, to say nothing of the birds, the fish, the insects, the unseen billions in the soil. The mountain itself was now 1,300 feet shorter than it had been that morning, its summit replaced by a crater a mile wide. And around 230 square miles of living, breathing wilderness had been converted into a gray smoking moonscape. But the worst of it, the truly dead heart of the disaster, was a stretch of ground just north of the crater that scientists named the Pumice Plain. This is where the pyroclastic flows came to rest, avalanches of pumice and ash so hot and so deep that they didn't just kill what was living on the surface. They erased the surface entirely, burying it under feet of sterile volcanic debris. No plants, no seeds, no roots, no insects, and critically, nothing alive in the ground itself. Because here's what most people never think about. Healthy soil isn't dirt, it's alive. A single handful of it holds billions of bacteria and fungi and microscopic organisms, an entire invisible civilization that makes it possible for anything to grow. The Pumice Plain had none of that. It was, in the most literal sense, a clean slate. Fresh rock, scrubbed of life, baking under the sun. And the Pumice Plain was trapped in a loop it could not break on its own. With no plants, nothing dropped leaves or roots to build organic matter. With no organic matter, no soil could form. With no soil, nothing could anchor and survive. And with nothing surviving, there were still no plants. Sterility feeding sterility. Year after year, a dead landscape, actively keeping itself dead. When the first scientists picked their way across that plain, the silence was total. This wasn't a forest that had been damaged. It was a place that had been returned to zero. And so the experts did the reasonable thing. They assumed it would stay that way for a very long time. The textbook said recovery would crawl in from the edges. Seeds would blow in on the wind from surviving forests miles away. A few would land, a few would sprout, and over decades, generations, life would slowly creep back across the dead zone from the outside in. The conventional wisdom gave the Pumice Plain a recovery timeline measured in human lifetimes. Some thought a true forest there might take 300 years. A few wondered if that ground would ever fully come back at all. It was a top-down model of recovery, life arriving from above and beyond, settling onto the wasteland and toughing it out. And on the Pumice Plain, that model went nowhere. Seeds did blow in, they landed on the pumice, and they died. The toughest pioneer plants, the ones that specialize in colonizing bare, brutal ground, managed a few scattered footholds, but the great gray expanse stayed almost completely empty. Year after year, the wasteland just sat there, refusing to follow the script. Here's the thing the textbook missed. A seed landing on the Pumice Plain wasn't a settler arriving on hard but workable land. It was a settler dropped into a place with no roads, no water lines, no power grid, and no way to build any of it. It didn't matter how hardy that seed was. A plant root, on its own, is a remarkably inefficient thing. It cannot pull enough water and enough nutrients out of sterile pumice to survive. Not in a place with no living soil to draw from. The problem was never really about getting seeds to the wasteland. The wind was already doing that. The problem was that the wasteland had no infrastructure to keep them alive once they arrived. And infrastructure doesn't blow in on the wind. It has to be built from below. This is where the Gophers come in. And to understand why they mattered, you have to meet the invisible thing they were carrying. It's called mycorrhizal fungi. These are not mushrooms you'd recognize. They're networks of microscopic threads that live in healthy soil. And they have spent tens of millions of years perfecting a single relationship. They plug directly into the roots of plants. The fungus wraps into the root and becomes an extension of it. A vast underground supply network reaching far beyond anything the root could touch on its own. It hunts down water, it scavenges scarce nutrients, it ferries both straight back to the plant, it even shields the plant from disease, and in exchange the plant pays it in sugar, the carbon it makes from sunlight. Neither one can thrive without the other. The plant is the power plant, the fungus is the pipeline. And on a dead volcanic plain with no living soil, a seed without that fungal pipeline is simply a settler with no water main. It will die of thirst sitting on top of the ground. So the real question on the Pumice Plain was never, how do we get plants up here? It was, how do we get the pipeline back? How do you reinstall an invisible underground network across miles of sterile rock? A team of ecologists, among them a young researcher named Michael Allen, had a strange idea. They knew that just beneath the fresh pumice, in some places, fragments of the old living soil still survived, buried and sealed off. And they knew that something in nature is built specifically to churn buried soil up to the surface and haul living material around the landscape. Gophers. Gophers are nature's tillers. They dig constantly, turning over enormous volumes of earth, dragging deep soil up and mixing it as they go. And a gopher doesn't travel clean. It carries spores, microbes, and seeds caught in its fur, packed under its claws, riding in its gut. A gopher is, in effect, a living delivery truck for the exact invisible network the Pumice Plain was missing. The hypothesis was almost insultingly simple. Put gophers on the dead ground for a day. Let them do what they always do. Dig, churn, mix, deposit. Let them haul a little buried life to the surface and scatter a little living soil behind them. Then take them away and see if anything changed. The scientists themselves weren't expecting much. These were animals most people consider pests, weighing only a few ounces each. The plan was to test a short-term reaction, a small nudge to a dead system. Nobody in 1982 imagined they were about to watch one of the most dramatic demonstrations of ecological recovery ever recorded. So they fenced off 2 small plots on the Pumice Plain, set the gophers loose inside for about 24 hours, and then carried them back off the mountain. And then they waited. The dead loop began to run backwards. In the patches the gophers had churned, fragments of living soil were now sitting at the surface, and with them, the mycorrhizal fungi. Now, when a wind-blown seed landed there, it didn't land alone on sterile rock. It landed on ground that had a pipeline waiting. The fungus plugged into the new root. The pipeline switched on. Water and nutrients started flowing to a plant that, a few feet away, would simply have died. And once a single plant survived, the loop the volcano had locked into reverse. That plant dropped litter and built a scrap of organic matter. It threw a little shade and held a little moisture. It fed the fungi more sugar, so the fungal network spread. More network meant more seedlings could survive, which meant more plants, which meant more litter, more shade, more fungi. The same self-feeding cycle that had kept the Pumice Plain dead was now running forward, building life on top of life. The results were not subtle. 6 years after a single day of digging, those gopher-touched plots held roughly 40,000 thriving plants. The untouched ground right beside them, same pumice, same weather, same windblown seeds, remained almost completely barren. 40,000 plants traced back to a borrowed afternoon with a few rodents. But the mountain had one more piece of evidence to offer, and it's the part that proves this wasn't luck. Somewhere else in the blast zone, the scientists compared two kinds of forest land. In one place, an old-growth forest had stood when the eruption hit. Even though the blast stripped those trees and buried them in ash, that ground had carried its own mycorrhizal fungi for centuries. And the trees came roaring back, far faster than anyone predicted, because the underground pipeline was already there, fed by the very needles the eruption knocked down. But on another stretch of the mountain, the land had been clear-cut by loggers before the eruption. The trees were already gone, and so the living fungal network in that soil had already been broken. And decades later, that clear-cut ground is still to this day mostly bare. Two pieces of land hit by the same volcano on the same mountain, and the one that kept its invisible network healed, while the one that had lost it stayed dead. That contrast is the whole story in miniature. It was never really about the trees. It was about what lived in the ground beneath them. And then came the headline that put all of this back in the news. In 2024, more than 40 years after the experiment, a team including microbiologists Michael Allen, Mia Maltz, and Emma Aronson published their findings in the journal Frontiers in Microbiomes. They had returned to the original gopher plots and analyzed the soil. The communities of fungi and bacteria where the gophers had dug for one day in 1982 were still distinct, still richer, still more alive than the soil where the animals were never introduced. One day of digging. A residual fingerprint in the living soil 4 decades later. As one of the original scientists put it, no one would ever have predicted that tossing a gopher onto a volcano for a single day could leave an effect you could still measure 40 years on. Step back and look at the whole chain. A volcano erased 230 square miles of life and buried the worst of it under sterile rock. The experts gave it a recovery timeline of centuries. The wind delivered seeds to the wasteland for years, and the wasteland killed every one of them. Because the thing that was missing was never visible from the surface. What that ground needed wasn't more seeds or more soil trucked in or a century of patience. It needed its invisible network back online. And the tool that did it wasn't a machine or a budget or an army of workers. It was a few gophers, a fence, and one afternoon of doing what gophers have always done. The force that destroyed that mountain was enormous, 2 billion tons of rock moving in seconds. The force that brought it back was small enough to hold in your hands. We tend to assume that rebuilding a broken world has to be as big as the thing that broke it. Mount St. Helens proved the opposite. The most powerful thing on that mountain wasn't the blast. It was a web of threads too thin to see, carried by a rodent, switched back on in a single day. Sometimes the world doesn't come back because we overpower the damage. It comes back because we reconnect what was quietly severed, and then get out of the way. This is Earthturn, where we dig up the engineering behind nature's greatest comebacks. Subscribe and watch the world come back to life.